Mediopolis, Chapter 24. The Show Searchers. The elderly man had taken Lucy, the new childminder, on her first day off, taking her around the house on his own guided tour, to stroll around and get to talk a little more with each other, taking her on a stroll along to the large libraries, the show libraries of the show house. He'd had plenty of time since retiring to the house to wander around and explore. Well, he was off doing part-time work sometimes, but fitting around his own condition, where he went out on occasions to explore many of the different floors and the rooms of the larger mansion. It was a great big expansive large house, a rambling old place, if ever there was one. He showed Lucy the old show libraries down in the old house, the old part of the basement house. It really wasn't seen that often, connecting to a few adjoining lounges where people could read and watch and listen, sitting in the shared lounges, showing the books of the various residents. They showed the books of the various residents who were writing openly, and they were also written about openly too. So the show library also had books that were written about the residents of the home, and also written by the show residents of the show house too. The older man during the tour, approaching the show library doors, he'd said that he often used to read about one of the residents themselves, reading some of the books about them within the show libraries. The house elders had written about him sometimes, and he'd even read occasionally about himself. The house elders had written about many of the other residents within the house. He read occasionally books by a few residents of the house themselves also, on all different subjects. They were classified variously, according to their genre types. Some of the elder children's books he also found even a little enlightening and a little entertaining too sometimes. And also he found them a little sad, sometimes a little funny, and a little confusing also. He claimed to have gotten nothing out of the younger children, whose books he claimed not to really properly understand. Even if the elder children still read those perhaps occasionally, though they claimed not to get that much out of them still. He'd stopped a long time ago. The young adult books, the adolescent books, he found a little more interesting, but still a little more challenging too. And then the middle-aged books, they were a real challenge, a hard challenge sometimes, very enlightening, but very mystifying too, and hilarious sometimes, but also tragic as well sometimes too, and enigmatic, so enigmatic the middle-aged books could be, so much that they both reassured him, but also sometimes left him deeply unsettled also, left him feeling profoundly confused at times, as to how to feel about them, about the ideas they'd raised in him, that he'd mull over long times afterwards. Or why to go on feeling at all, they'd questioned some of the middle-aged books, exploring all sorts of different ideas and feelings. He never understood them all at all. No, even some of them that he saw regularly, still was challenging and struggling to understand. Then there were the elder books. They were much harder to find. Not all the elder books had survived, of course, in a readable condition that was still legible. Of course, many of the books were missing pages, or perhaps sometimes whole chapters, long great lengths of the story and its narrative, having so many gaps that there were more gaps than there were actual parts of the story. Sometimes that made it much harder, therefore, to piece together and decipher what the larger narrative was. Before finishing with some unresolved storyline, sometimes you could be working ages trying to piece together different chapters to find out what chronological order they were meant to be in, or what could have happened in the in-between chapters missing. Some, of course, that were found were even then much harder to decipher also, because they were often using archaic, old-fashioned language, older words, that were mostly retired words now. Other words were written or spoken in an older style, so they were words in current usage, but they were much more used in a different way, in an earlier meaning. As well as using old wordings, they also seemed to be much longer and could sometimes be great rambling chapters. They were, when all the chapters were found, a very long read often, because they were elder stories, so they would tend to be long, meandering, rambling tales that covered great expanses of time, with narratives that spanned across many decades often, sometimes continents too, and included vast numbers of people indeed, large numbers of acquaintances, friends, family, colleagues, managers, bosses, exes, and even strangers, and all manner of others. There were extremely long lists of different characters, and then even longer lists of relationships between those characters. So it was much harder to really fully understand as a whole, to comprehend the fuller meaning of the stories of the elder books, if one even found enough of the fragments to decipher, because of all the fragmentation, the missing pieces, and the harder, archaic, older wordings. The elder books still, though, if you could find one and find something that was relatable, they were compelling reading, those still. Would it be too blinding or too mystifying, though, if such elder books were restored, if it was possible to collect all the missing chapters and to somehow translate the archaic terms? The elder man had wondered, unsure if it was even possible to preserve a coherent record from such an older time, so very long ago, and whether the decomposition of everything, the natural processes of entropy, didn't affect psychology too, and everything else, that everything didn't gradually fade and get lost or go missing or fragmentate. Wasn't that just the natural process of everything anyway, perhaps? And of books certainly left out to the light that would gradually fade away, or those that would be broken, torn, lost, miscopied, or misremembered where they were. Wasn't the decomposition of everything, including the books, and of people's abilities over longer periods of time to remember, didn't that mean that those stories so long ago just couldn't be known up to and beyond a certain point? Wasn't that why older stories were always more mystifying, especially the further back you go? The stories we learn and tell each other can only begin when we're able to start telling them, and there could be earlier times that we cannot know about because we were not able to record them. We can only begin when we are able to, and must finish when we are no longer able to too. So people's stories begin before they're able to tell them, or to write them, or to hear them of others. And they end before. They end before people are able to stop. No one is born a storyteller or a storyteller. People learn to tell and learn to listen, learn to share as they get older. Then, if perhaps we're not born storytellers or story hearers either, then we don't have to die story hearers or storytellers either. Many people don't die as story hearers or as storytellers. The elder had wondered, yet of course, you could die in the act of telling or of listening or reading or writing any story. Yet even if you carried on reading, writing, telling, hearing, or shouting, singing it, or whatever, you could just get older and older, and it could become hard, much harder to participate within it, becoming harder hearing, much harder to hear the other tellers perhaps, or harder to interpret, or near blinded to the writers. Don't we all have accidents, injuries, illnesses, incidents, and lesser abilities as we get older? The more we live and acquire more problems and more difficulties, aren't we all then destined eventually to gradually or suddenly lose abilities? Ones that we'd worked hard and lived with for years and studied on for long. Still, an elder book that's a struggle to read is not a dead book. Perhaps it could be a dying book even, but not a dead book, essentially, that has nothing to say anymore, nor a locked book necessarily, that may have something to say to those with the key or those that know how to find it or open it. There are the many closed books of the elders too, those that are not able to be opened anymore, that have already finished the telling of the story, that may well be living the story and no longer able or necessary to tell it. Some books that are so old and harder to open can sometimes with care and caution be gently opened without damaging the material within it. It is the case with many damaged books that one must handle them with great care, especially those of great age. Some books need to be repaired before they can actually be properly read or put back together or bound up properly or deciphered or translated even, before they can properly be understood. Like those that have unnumbered pages that need to be shuffled into the correct chronological order, perhaps, that otherwise would make no sense, yet could still be important knowledge if reassembled and put back together correctly, or the loose pages bound back together in a more sensible schematic order that is relevant in a subjective order. Many are the muddled stories that need much attention before they can properly be deciphered and reasonably understood. There was the open show library that the elder man was strolling through, showing young Lucy on her day off the various genres of the different books, great long hallways that led to multiple rooms, and within each room there were lots of multiple sections. Within each section there were multiple shelves, an incredible vast array of different books and different combinations of genres. There were many more than he'd ever heard of because of all the different possible numerous combinations. So many bizarre ones too, Lucy had thought, marvelling at the sheer wonder, the sheer amount of different books and the different weird titles. Just what the elder had said when the mother of the show house, or the show mother, one of the show mothers as she was called, one of the hosts, she'd stunned the older man with the sheer amount of books, telling him to show some of the new visitors too when he had a chance, and the incredible variety too, as well as the sheer number, that he enjoyed also showing and surprising new visitors to, as he'd been surprised himself, and still was often as well. Like new housekeeping Lucy, she was also quite surprised at many of the different surprising genres that they encountered, and all the different surprises that lay before them. The older man saying that he would often borrow one of the open books to learn something from it, or just to enjoy something for a pleasant few hours, or simply out of curiosity sometimes, intrigued by a strange picture on the cover, or a strange paragraph that lured him in and awakened his curiosity somehow. He showed us some of the stranger genres that he'd discovered and thought particularly strange himself. There were the comedy horror stories that were surprising to him, so many of them as well, and not just one strange author, but many different authors that had contributed to them. Could one make a comedy of horror? They weren't two things he would ordinarily put together, but maybe they did sometimes. Maybe that was just the experiences of those authors, he'd wondered. No, there were so many of them, so many different genres, that had confused the older man at first. Could something horrible ever really be funny, though? Or maybe it wasn't actually that the horror itself was funny, maybe it was just funny despite the horrible circumstances, or whatever it was. Then there were the romantic comedies, as well as the comedy horrors. The romantic comedies, and then there were a combination of romantic comedy horrors too. There were no end of different combinations. Musical comedy horrors, tragic comedy horrors, even happy comedy horrors. However, that was possible. The old man had wondered at that, thinking maybe he'd take that out to have a look. Historical comedy horrors, set way back in an ancient world, or in a near distant past. And then futuristic comedy horrors too, that concerned the older man a little bit more, wondering then what that could all mean. More than the historical ones, the future ones he found more interesting looking forward, that seemed to imagine the world he lived in somehow, becoming both more hilarious but horrendous too in some way, in equal measures it seemed. It seemed strange to leave a reading or listening and both be amused yet also somehow concerned and fearful too. Most of the horror books were not comedies, of course, however, or had no real comedic element especially. Or if they did, they contained many other elements besides. And there were so many. There were also the romantic horrors too, of course. Musical horrors, tragic horrors, happy horrors. Well, they were more uplifting despite the horrors, apparently. Or perhaps even with some because of it. Who knew? The older man wasn't perhaps sure himself. Perhaps it depended on the book and where it was written and how. There were the family horror stories as well, in the family section, and then the strangers' horror stories as well. Historical horrors, futuristic horrors. Seemingly, there were just so many shelves and shelves, all crammed in with different books, endless rows of the shelves in endless rooms of that section of the library. An incredible bouret. Just an incredible giant maze of bookshelves, taller than the man himself, so that stairs on wheels had to be moved around to ascend and reach up to the upper shelves. And he had to crouch down on all fours to reach the floor books on the lower levels. Young wandering Lucy was amazed at the sheer amount of different horror books and all the combination of different genres that they could fuse with, and the sheer different amount of them as well. Just everywhere. She was amazed how many different rooms, dozens and dozens of rooms, each one stacked in every wall and lined with shelves, reaching from the bottom of the floor right up taller than a person, 3 or 4 foot high in some places, all stacked and crammed full of rooms. Sometimes there were books even beyond the books when she took a few of the front layer out. Amazed at the sheer amount of it all, really. And that was just a small horror section of the entire library. Although the older man had said that there would be multiple copies of some of those books in other sections of the library too, those that cross-reference with other genres and contained important elements of those genres. A fantasy horror, for example, would be also found in the fantasy section, as well as the horror section too. There could be multiple copies of the books found in multiple genre sections of the show library, so that it depended. There were different numbers of those books stored in multiple places if they had multiple elements in their type of genre. Lucy had wandered round the horror section, staring at some of the weird, strange, and a little frightening, bewildering pictures and titles that some of them offered on the outskirts. She had wondered why there was such an obsession within the house about all these horror stories. Why were there tens of thousands, perhaps even more, of these horror stories, and such combinations with everything imaginable? Why was the house so obsessed with horrible stories? Had they all witnessed or suffered something awful, something horrible themselves, or in their earlier life? Perhaps being adopted before they'd entered into the house? Or was it something that had happened during their time within the house? Had that prompted and provoked them all into writing all these horrible stories about each other or about their own experiences? Lucy wasn't yet sure about that, and had many questions about it, because the horror section was a vast, vast section with multiple rooms within it, each one crammed with all the shelves stacked with all the books. It just seemed too many for one house to have that many horrible books. She looked around it, wondering if all the other sections were perhaps the same size, or whether they were perhaps smaller, not sure yet, having not gone on a tour round the wider show library beyond the horror show section they'd only gone through so far. Lucy had questioned the older man, following him around the old decaying house show library. No, the elder had said, he'd only really shown her a very small sample of the horror section so far, really. That was only a small fragment, really, of the horror section. There were multiple other rooms through the corridor beyond that, in another additional horror section, ones they hadn't even looked at yet. Those was nothing to get excited about. That was a very small number of the books that he'd shown her, so he claimed. A small fragment of the overall number of horrible books. Nothing really, he shrugged. But remember, vast numbers of residents had passed through the house, so those could have been stored from long, long ago as well, he'd reassured her, trying to reassure her at least. Yet he really didn't believe that it was such an obsession as she was suggesting to have so many other books, more than she'd really imagined. No, he didn't think the house was obsessed with horrible stories in particular. Saying that they just happened to start at the horror section, that's where he led her to first. That if she'd gone to a different section to begin with, she'd be amazed and marvelled equally at the sheer scope and size of all the other generic sections as well. Though, yes, he reassured her, were all just as large, magnificent in their scope, as the horror section was also. even though many of them did contain, as said, multiple copies of the horror books, if they also contained other relevant elements within their section genre too. So a musical romantic futuristic horror itself would be in the 4 different generic sections. There will be 4 different copies to be found in each of the respective generic show sections. There were endless combinations, of course, so it seemed, even a futuristic historical horror. The older man had wondered how that was even possible. How was it possible to have futuristic historical stories at all? Whether they were futuristic historical romances, futuristic historical comedies, tragedies, or any other combinations, or any of the future historical genres. How was that possible? Reading some of the books, he found that they were historical people imagined in a future world or some future environment, as the historical characters could travel even with the historical beliefs, historical costumes, and perhaps even into various futures they would be transplanted. This genre was not to be confused with the historical future section, not reimagined future people in the past, as if futuristic people or technologies could appear in an ancient or older world. The history section is where the elder man wanted to go to next, to stroll through there with young visitor curious Lucy. He was easy to follow along with, and it wasn't far, he said. Yet Lucy had felt she could probably find her own way there, with all the large signposting around as well. Perhaps didn't need him to guide her around anyway. But following a guide who had his own interest about it was perhaps interesting. She followed him round, perhaps humouring him a little, as he showed historical book sections of historical tragedies, and there were a lot of tragic history books, and a lot of every type of book it seemed. A history of comedy, some very funny histories from the titles, so it seemed. There were the romantic histories, happier histories, some lovely history books, and she enjoyed looking through those. Joyful ones, those were. Not as appealing as the lovely future books, though, of course, the older man had said, looking over to the future section, and where he'd like to go over occasionally. The speculative future section where they could wonder at possible future worlds, possible future scenarios, possible future scientific discoveries. There were the serious scientific history books too, of course. The history of religious books, philosophies, societies, people, geographies, well, everything you could think of. There were histories of all sorts of things, even an animistry. No, it wasn't written by animals, though, but written on behalf of animals. A history of animals, written about the animals on their behalf, as they, of course, were illiterate and couldn't write books for people, the older man had joked. But there were books that didn't just focus on their biology and anatomy, but on their behaviour and also on their history as well. There were tree histories too, as well as histories of the trees, written by tree lovers or people that had studied trees and studied their histories. And he had taken out a book himself, the older man, to borrow on ancient woodlands for part of his own research into some of the old tree theologies, looking clearly at its place so that he would know the reference to return it to when he'd later finished with it, or when it had finished with him. The older man then took Lucy away to the her story section, feeling that that would be much more appropriate for her, of course. Those were the books that were written especially about the histories of women, or the herstories of women, as it was called, to compensate for the bias, of course, that most of the other history books in the history section had been written mostly by men, for men, and often about men too, in general, though that had changed much over the recent times. But still there was an incredible bias. So there was a whole her story section as well that were written predominantly by women and often for women as well, and often about women that they'd focus on much more. And that's what he referred her to read, of course, being a woman. That there were a minority of women scholars in olden times, of course, but there were many more today, and there would be many more in the future. Yet today's books were written as much by women as men now. They had an equality of literacy now, whereas in the past that wasn't always the case, the older man had reassured her. Many parts of the house, too, it wasn't always the case as well. Lucy had said it was better to just have history books rather than have herstory books separate and maybe put them together. But somehow it was good to have both perspectives too. And he was glad that he pointed out there was a hysterical book section as well to the library. Then there were the books written specifically that only for women, that men were not allowed to. So that was written only for women, that were aimed only at a women's audience, that were specifically only about women's issues. And they were written mostly by women, of course, a vast majority of them. Occasionally, some were written by children and others were written by adolescents. And there were some, a minority, also written by men that were only for women audiences. These books only focused on issues for women from a female perspective or aimed at a female audience. They focused on the issues specific only to women. There was a specific section for men also, likewise. Even the many other books that were written by men, the actual men's section of the library, were books written for men, usually written by men themselves. Yet occasionally it was written by a woman author or by women authors, trying to give a women's perspective on the men's issues. So there were also women's books written only for men, just as there were men's books written only for the women. There were also many other child authors too, and adolescents, who only wrote for women or for men, so that they could understand more about the experiences of children and adolescents also. Then there were the books that were written for children, by adult authors themselves, by older men and women too. Those were written only for children. Some were written for children as well as adults, so it was quite complex, really, the older man had explained. There were many child authors too, the child authors that could be chosen to write whatever they wanted to. These were books written by the children. They were sometimes written for the older adults to give them the child's perspective to the adult world. As the child authors could also write books for other children too, though. And they were more popular, of course, because they could understand each other much more. As the adult books were mostly written for other adults, but sometimes adults also wrote for children. Children usually wrote books likewise just for other children, but they would sometimes write also for the adults as well. The children's section of the show library were the books aimed specifically at children, that again could be by adult authors, male or female, trying to entertain or to educate the youths. Then there were also just the children's books in that department, children's books written for each other, by their brothers and sisters, by other children, or about other children, that could be any number of different things. They would write for each other. Child authors were very popular with other child authors, like the adult authors were often very popular with the other adult authors, of course, the older man had said, as if all that was obvious, Lucy nodding along. The children wrote books for each other on many different things, even writing their own history books, of course, of their own life or their friends' or families' lives. Some wrote geography books, drawing out pictures, usually about their local parks or a local forest that they visit, or the cats that they see in the local area, or any different things in their local area, local back gardens they visit, any number of things. It could be epic journeys they've made across the city, or school trips perhaps, said the older man. They wrote many highly imaginative pieces of art, on all different subjects, of course. They even did imaginary future contributions too, the older man had told her. Often with colourful pictures too, to go with them. The imaginations, the older man had said. The older man had known. He'd seen the colouring in pictures of some of them, passing through one of the countless study groups and looking at a few of the pictures they'd shown him, inspired and intrigued and confused by some of them, while he was visiting by on one of the floors. Yet he knew nothing really of what the content of the books that the pictures were designed for, really. Surely the adults write books for children, asked Lucy, puzzled at this closed section of the children's books that were written only for children. And the older man had said, they do. He'd just shown them earlier. There are adult authors and also child authors aimed at the childhood audience themselves. He just wanted to show Lucy that the children's stories about them and also by them, for them as well, they did exist, and that even if neither of them could access them and wouldn't want to anymore, neither of them would need to, the older man had said, of course. After all, we have all the adult sections to go to now, and the elder sections too, and they're vast enough. You could spend lifetimes in there, the older man had claimed. That the children can't enter into those, of course, because only the adults could enter into the adult sections of the library. Only the men could go into the for men only sections, and likewise only the women go into the women only sections. And then there are the gender neutral sections as well, and then the all people section as well, the general library part. And only children were allowed to read from some of the children's books, the ones specifically only written for them. That was just the rules of the house, as complex and many as they were, explained the older man, carefully, saying that he just wanted Lucy to see some of the books only written for children, and some only for the elders, and some only for men, just so she knew that those were there for the others, and so that she knew also that there were books written only for her as a woman too, and that there were books written for her only as an adult, for her age and gender as well. They passed by briefly, seeing many of the different written books in their gender departments. Sometimes the older man had taken out a book by one of the child authors who had written for the older audiences, to see what the children's views were on a number of issues that he was researching, different topics that he was researching, and he'd wanted to get a perspective from different ages. So he'd taken out books from the elder department, from the adult section, and also from the adolescent department too. At all the different ages, he'd taken out relevant books on the actual different topics that he was researching, to get the different perspectives from the different age groups. He would need to write in a similar style to those different ages of how they actually wrote or drew or pictured things. So he would need to be able to adapt and copy those styles and learn from them if he was to communicate with those other groups, if he ever wanted to do that. So he felt it was something useful to do, to read the books written by different age groups, written by the elders, by middle-aged groups, by younger groups, and also by the child groups. Using adult ideas, styles, and words, sometimes it will be wrong to try and use those if it was for an elderly adult audience or for an adolescent or childhood audience. Of course, it would have to be appropriate, but you'd have to read or listen to some of their work to know what was appropriate and the type of ways that they did talk. The child authors had given him a different perspective on the children's views, just as the women's books had given him a woman's perspective more. And the elder books gave him often an elderly perspective at life as well. They were often aimed, sometimes, specifically at his age group or a male audience, and that was most useful when they were able to cater the language towards his own age and group. And the young adult author, as well as the middle-aged, and the elder authors, had all tried not to discriminate and tried to read books by different genders and also of different ages. Even though, being an older man, he was still attracted to older books most, because those were the ones that he could relate to closely. He could relate to them more. He'd lived through such similar ages, such close past ages as to the other older books. So of course, being from the same age group, an older person could relate to older books much more. So he found the older books much more attractive mentally and stimulating as well, challenging, intriguing, reassuring too sometimes, even though he found it very difficult to tolerate too many of the children's books. Yet occasionally he did find them somewhat funny, inquisitive, and more than anything, he found them more innocent-minded than many of the adult books, and even the elder books too. So he still liked to read and got something from the younger books, the children books, and also the adolescent books and the middle-aged books too, that he learnt lots from. Even though the adult books themselves, they were much more corrupt than the children's books. But even so, even though they were more corrupt books, more flawed books, yet still they were much more virtuous books as well, more informative books, more funny, hilarious books, some of them. Even though there were some books that may disgust him, there were others that attracted him greatly. Whereas the child authors were not really that offensive to him, neither were they really that compelling and alluring in the same way that older books were. Now, of course, they were all making films and had long ago moved on from books and reading and writing, hearing and listening to them. Now, of course, they'd moved on to films and they loved the moving images rather than just the still books. They loved to hear the books. They loved to hear the films and watch the films for each other, about each other, or by each other. No, they weren't interested in the books anymore, said the older man, scraping dust off some of the cobwebs that were on some of the older books. The elder man had said, with a handful of the books that he was taking away for his studies, some of them quite dusty, really. And visitor Lucy, being concerned, she was looking at him, wondering if he could carry them all, but he seemed to manage. And then, following a step behind, in case he stumbled, yet he hobbled along, wearily, making it away just carefully to an armchair, where he collapsed inside it, somewhat theatrically, where he lowered himself down, and his legs puffed out. And she watched him sinking into the armchair, thinking maybe she should leave him alone with his notes, to think about it, until perhaps later, when he'd had his siesta and was tired. And they'd made their exchanges goodbye, and she thanked him for giving him a brief tour around the small show library. He gradually had fallen asleep, after young Lucy had left him, summoned to some discussion with the show mother somewhere, to discuss the next week's work's progress. Lucy complained that she was just too busy, eternally visiting or leaving the children, so much so that she never really felt that she'd got to meet the children. She believed that she was going into a job as a childminder, yet she'd spent so little time with any of the children yet. She was always visiting them all, or had brief talks with them all, and occasionally got to talk to a few of them a little, but was concerned that she'd just spent so little time getting to know them properly, truly, deeply, and that it was just such a rush. So much time was spent just doing the journeying, so that they could do. But the mother had listened to her at this, aware that she had struggled with many of her timings, yet had reassured her. The show mother had said she would get someone else to do the shadow shifts for next week's journeys, so that they could do half of her journeys for her, to do half of the visits too, and that would give her twice the time to do the listening and the talking, and also do the watching as well. And so they could also have twice the time to watch and listen and talk to her as well, and not to worry, as they'll have much more of a chance to get to know each other. She'll have a shadow worker doing all the opposite shifts that she's doing next week. And the mother will also be watching in and listening in too, behind closed doors, through all the monitors. And if she has any troubles in understanding any of the children's stories and how they communicate, then she could always talk to her. She's on hand to discuss things, and she could always help translate their words, because she does know them well. And she can translate them into the language that Lucy would understand well then. And to talk to her at any time, the show mother had said. Although, of course, she'd been quite busy and had not much time during the last week so far to talk to her. But she said and promised she would try and make more time as the work went on. She'd done so before, but only a little, with some of the child housekeepers before, yet most of them wouldn't need a translator that often, or they hadn't done anyway in past episodes. But as she matured more in the job and became an adolescent housekeeper, she'd need to talk to the show mother much less often. And when she became a fully mature adult housekeeping working in there, when she was an adult housekeeping worker, she would know the job so proficiently, she'd never have to ask her any advice at all. In fact, would be giving out advice to the trainee child trialer to the childminders like she'd been before herself. She'd be the one giving out the advice. But until then, yes, she could still speak to the mother next week. And to the others, she reassured Lucy. Lucy had asked if perhaps she could help in pushing the food carts around. She really needed extra help to push some of the heavier food carts, that and the medication carts, then the trash cart, the post cart. It was all getting a little tiring, doing all the heavy physical journeying. And she'd not known to begin with that the job would just be so physical, that there would be so much journeying between so many of the different children. She didn't know that first there would be so many children, nor that they would be so distant from each other, to be having to journey so often around so many that were distant from each other. Neither did she know that there would be so many journeys throughout the whole day to go round them all. She had complained, saying this all to the show mother, upset that she hadn't known fully the whole small details of what she'd been going into to begin with. The showman had shrugged and said the advert had been explicit and clear enough, and she could always have asked much more details, and she hadn't asked all of those things, but she had given as much as she felt she needed to give at the beginning. No, she was sorry that she hadn't given out more and would give out more information to the next potential trial of childminders and make sure that they knew more about it. Yes, okay, she admitted, she would try and do that for the others. Yet this was part of the care that the children had needed. And since there were still so many, and that they needed Lucy, and poor Lucy was still so young, she would try and get her the shadow worker to accompany her for next week's shifts, if that was possible. And the show director had already arranged a shadow worker who would alternate in doing the shifts with her next week, so that they could do the rounds together, alternating the shifts, so that the shadow worker could do every other round for her. During the various visits to the house, so the shadow worker would always do the round before and the round after her, so that the children would always see the alternating faces at the door, and never just her again, reassured the mother to her. And in the times freed up between doing all the visits,